Hey, thanks for thinking my thumbnail was worth your click. Stick around and I'll show you how I built this jewelry box. It has these cool necklace sliders and a chandelier. It has a place to display something special and this nifty drawer. It even has a secret compartment somewhere. So keep watching to see how I did it. I'm using poplar for this because it's easy to get and easy to work with. I start by laying out each piece to get a rough idea of the cuts I need to make. I then run it through my planer to get the maximum width that I need. This is a new tool for me, and as you can see, I'm super excited to use it. I then take the board to the miter saw and the table saw to get the exact dimensions that I need. I'm only working off a rough sketch at this point, so I might need to come back later and make some different cuts. And for that reason, I actually like to use tape to put the entire box together before using any glue or screws or anything like that. And as you can see, my initial mock-up looks pretty good. From there, I started to glue up the carcass of the jewelry box. And off camera, I put a couple of nails in the side just to make sure it was secure. Now I'm ready to make the mortises for these little hinges. And to do that, I just use an X-Acto knife to score the lines and then a really sharp chisel to cut the mortise. I don't know about you, but there's something so satisfying about using hand tools. Once that was done, I again used tape to make sure these hinges were in place and a little bit of CA glue before screwing the doors together. This helped me know the exact spot that those mortises need to go, which made drilling the screw holes for the hinges that much easier. Next, I moved on to the drawer. I needed some thinner pieces of wood, which means I get to use my new planer again. The drawer has pretty simple construction, just using butt joints and a 1/4-inch plywood on the bottom. I don't anticipate too much heavy use on the drawer, so I didn't use nails or screws here. I then used some CA glue for the drawer front, which helped to hold it in position while the wood glue dried. This cove molding that I want to use is a little bit thinner than this 3/4-inch poplar, so much better. I think this cove molding gives it the perfect touch. All right, so the carcass is pretty much done. These doors are working well. The drawer is complete and opens up nicely. And this top is done. I'm not gonna fasten it yet, so it's easier to finish. But now it's time to start working on the insides here. I'm gonna start with the chandelier. The chandelier is gonna be held in place by this bolt, which just goes right through the top. And then later I'll show you there's little hooks that screw into this little circle. I used the disc sander and a little chamfer around the edges to make it look a little more polished. I also used this little metal bushing, which helps it spin around that bolt a lot easier. I got an extra long bolt knowing that I could cut it to size. And after a couple of taps with the hacksaw, it came right off. And now that that's done, I just drilled a couple of pilot holes where those hooks will go in. All right, so now that the chandelier is done, the next part is to make these little sliders on the sides, and believe it or not, they make a 4-inch full extension drawer slide. Can you believe that? I couldn't. I could not believe it when I came across these on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description below, but these are hilarious to me. And so what I think I'm gonna do is try to embed them into a piece of wood and fasten that on the side so you can't really see it. But the idea is that she'll be able to pull the wood out with her little necklaces on there and pull them out and get easier access to them instead of being hindered by the chandelier that's here. So that is the next step. I'm going to route out a couple of channels and some wood and embed these in there, and I think it's going to look okay. Instead of a router, I actually just used little strips of wood to build up around those drawer slides. And after an excessive amount of clamping, once the glue is dried, I actually just used scissors to cut the wood apart. And if you're new here and like this video so far, go ahead and subscribe. I used tape again so I could hold these slides in place while I tested them. And then later off camera, I used some 5-minute epoxy to hold them in place. And I gotta tell you, I was thrilled with the way that this turned out. I didn't know if it was gonna work when I originally designed it, but I love the way that this is gonna work. Okay, now that those little slider doodads are done, it's time to work on the secret compartment. And the way that the secret compartment is gonna work is I'm gonna use this and make a top with some pins in it. And this is gonna be like an inside box, and these are gonna be like an outside box. And well, let me just show you. Okay, so here it is. This is gonna sit under the chandelier, and the way that this is gonna work is I think I'm gonna cover it in felt so it's gonna look like it's supposed to be there, like it's displaying something special right here. But what's really gonna happen is this piece right here is gonna have some pins in it that go all the way through this top box and stick into the bottom box, and that is gonna hold it from being able to pull out. And then after you take this part off and set it aside, this will slide out like this. And I'm going to install some rails in here that go along the inside here, and so this will not be able to pull up because of those rails and not be able to pull out because of those pins. And so once you pull this part off and this part out, it will reveal the secret compartment in here. I hope that explanation made sense, but if it didn't, I'll go into it in a little bit more detail later in the video. Here I am cutting the slots for the rails to slide through, which is going to lock it in place from being able to pull up. And I am not a fine woodworker by any stretch of the imagination, so this really tested my skills. Once I knew where those rails were going to go, I just used a little bit of wood glue and some clamps to hold them in place while it dried. Then I taped the entire contraption together and drilled holes for the pins, which is just made up of an old nail. And again, the hacksaw, just a couple of taps and it came right apart. I then put the pins in place and secured them with some CA glue. And now you can kind of see how this key is going to work. Next, I drilled some holes for some rare earth magnets, and that kind of helps keep everything together while it's not locked in place. And I also did the same thing for the doors. And finally, I glued the secret compartment in place. All right, so good news, the build here is done. I'm going to take it apart, fill in any imperfections, give it a really good sanding, and then put the finish on it. I've been using Bondo a lot in my woodworking. I feel like it sands really strong and gives everything a really good finish, especially when you have big holes like this that I had to fill. And because it's so strong, my power sander came in really handy here. Doing this by hand would not be fun. And here you can see how smooth of a finish I get. After several sanding sessions, it was ready for paint. And for that, I used this Krylon spray-on primer and did 2 coats of that with a light sanding in between. And for the finish, I used this Krylon lacquer, which gives it a really strong and durable finish after only a couple of coats. I highly recommend it. You may have noticed that I had some painter's tape in certain parts, and that was so I could epoxy everything together without the finish getting in the way. And because this is end grain, epoxy is the only way to go to keep it strong enough. I know I might get a hard time for not using nails or screws, but I think the epoxy is going to do just fine. In order to avoid a mess or any squeeze out, I just used a little bit of tape on the sides, and that helped give me a really clean edge. And now that that's done, I can start putting everything together and putting on some of the finishing touches. The hinges went on first, and because everything was pre-assembled, it was really simple to do this. And I gotta say, it was really satisfying to open those doors in the drawer with it all finished for the first time. All right, so now that the finish is on, I'm gonna line the inside of the drawer and the jewelry box. And to do that, I'm gonna use this self-adhesive felt. I just picked this up at the craft store. I did a couple test pieces and it actually works really well. It doesn't come off or anything like that. I looked into flocking, but for this, I think I'm just gonna use this felt. I gotta say, this self-adhesive felt was way easier to work with than I thought it was gonna be. It has a fair amount of stretch to it and is actually really forgiving. If you're like me and not brave enough to take on flocking, I highly recommend it. And even though that was riveting, I'm gonna use a little movie magic to do the inside. So satisfying. Here you can see the cover for the secret compartment covered in felt, as well as the magnet and the holes for the pins that I put in the top. And while the cover slides in very nicely, I'm about to show you a near fatal flaw in this entire thing. When I put the key in, it's just a little bit tight where it's not going down all the way. And it's way too hard for a 7-year-old to use. All right, so here's a mistake I made on this. These holes line up perfectly with these holes over here, and these pins are what locks it into place. And when I did those measurements, I did not account for the felt on the back wall here. So it sticks out about 1/16 of an inch and creates it to be just a little bit too hard for this key to lock it all in place. So to fix that, I think what I'm gonna do is file down these pins here, and hopefully that will work. All right, so I got these pins filed down pretty well. It's still not perfect, but it's a lot better. And I'm gonna show you how it works. So this goes in to cover up the secret compartment. And this key, we're gonna call it, goes on like this. You can see there is about a 1/16 of an inch gap back there that is relatively unnoticeable if you're not looking for it, especially if you're looking at it from standing up. So we're gonna go with it. It's not perfect, but it's gonna be fine, and she is gonna get the biggest kick out of this. I found some L hooks that with a slight modification work perfectly for this box. And now you get a better idea of how the chandelier and those drawer slides are gonna work. To make a little handle for each drawer slide, I just cut the head off of the screw that came with the knobs and then screwed it in to kind of make a little knob nubbin. And once that was done, I could put it in place using some CA glue. And I know that these drawer slides are technically flipped around, but that's the way I needed to do it in order for them to work. And here you can see how that bushing gives that chandelier a really good spin, as well as how these finished drawer slides work. And finally, the finishing touches by putting these knobs on.
George, it's beautiful. I can hang my most prized possession right here.
That's exactly right. That's what I made it for. That's a prized possession. Then you've got a little chandelier up here. You want to know something else?
What?
It's got a secret compartment. This part comes off. And this part slides out. Slide that out. Secret.
Secret compartment.
And then you put it on there, and you got it. Perfect.
I love George. I love it. And you could also maybe hang one on there.
Mm-hmm.
This one's really nice. There. Put them in there. And put you in there too.